our COBT listeners and viewers, it's Maynard, Jeff, and Mike here with a super special guest, Mike Sommers. He's a good friend. He's the president and CEO of the American Petroleum Institute. We were telling Mike just as he joined us to begin the conversation, you know, what a treat, because when we think about one person you can call in Washington, D.C. and ask all your energy questions, get the latest, get the behind the scenes. Mike, we can't think of a better person. We really appreciate you joining us, and we can't wait to get into the conversation with you.
Great. Thanks, Maynard. Looking forward to it.
Mike Bradley, before we jump in with Mike Sommers, what would you tell us about the world, the markets, what's happening out there?
Yeah, Maynard, I thought we were going to be able to drop the Trump utility comment a few weeks back, right? And then, sort of over the weekend, we got the steel tariffs and the aluminum tariffs going from 25 to 50%. So that's kind of helping some of those stocks today, but it's, impacting the markets a little bit. Dow's down like 150, 200 points, which is honestly not much, but it is out there. So I think what the lesson to be learned is you don't know what's going to happen. There's still some volatility out there. We have talked about this for some weeks as it relates to the broader markets that, the broader markets are simply overbought, technically overbought. And so any volatility that you introduce in this market is going to be downward volatility for the most part. So that's the first thing. As it relates to some of the stories that were the big movers, over the weekend, we talked about this in our weekly wrap last week, and it was going to be the OPEC meeting, right? OPEC was expected to raise July production by another 400,000 barrels a day. They did. One of the things we said in our weekly wrap for our partner companies on Friday was that the expectations was that they were going to raise production. If they didn't, then prices would have spiked. The question is, they raised production. Why are prices up $2 a barrel on WTI today? I don't think it has much to do with OPEC. I think a lot of it has to do with what happened in Russia over the weekend with Ukraine bombing them. I think the prospect of them being in close to peace is probably being pushed out. Who knows what the response is, but I think that's why crude oil is rising today. It's not only the expectations game where sentiment is really, really bad. And so anything good, which is, obviously the 400,000 wasn't good. Any expectation that any positive expectation would be received well, because sentiment is just so bearish in crude oil pits. I think from an energy equity standpoint, most of the earnings are behind us, but I think that stood out to us was last week EOG buying Encino for $5.6 billion. Encino's in Utica. The question is what is EOG doing? I think this really kind of points to that in energy, specifically in E&Ps, having inventory, a runway of inventory, good inventory, is something that has been hanging over a lot of these equities. They're adding to their inventory. This makes this a third key core region for EOG. But I also think that the upside to this too is EOG in their conference call talked about that they believe that there's an inflection point in natural gas occurring in 2025. And if you think about the Utica, they're sort of up in the Northeast. We saw, it's going to be interesting to talk to Mike about this, but we saw, that wind farm out in Long Island that was shut down. Equinor's Empire Wind farm was shut down. It got reversed by Trump, and Hochul, the governor, said something to the effect that, we would be open to energy infrastructure. And that kind of says that, does the Constitution pipeline actually become a prospect out there? If it is, if it does eventually get built, that's good for, sort of Northeast Marcellus type producers, Utica type producers. So this deal might be a backdoor way to play gas as well. So I thought that was an interesting deal. So with that, Maynard, we'll hand it back to you.
Okay, awesome. Jeff, anything before we jump in with Mike Sommers?
Yeah, maybe just two quick things. Piggyback on what Mike said. It's easy to get lost in the ups and downs of oil, whether it's tariffs, whether it's OPEC, whether it's geopolitical conflict. Ultimately, what keeps us constructive around long-term oil prospects is supply growth is hard, but we need economic growth, we need demand growth. So I still think we can get caught in the volatility, and ultimately the key to getting oil right is all about demand pull. Supply side, I think people have a reasonable handle on. Maybe OPEC has a little more spare capacity, but absent economic growth, we're going to be kind of stuck in the mud for a bit. and then you just juxtapose it with the comment on maybe there's a shot at some more gas infrastructure in the U.S. It's easy to see why sentiment on gas is so positive, because we do have that demand pull, and the question is going to be at what price do we settle out on gas price, because there's a lot of supply on that side.
Mike, maybe that's one place. There's so many. I alluded to it in the upfront. Wow, we could talk about so many things. I just want to grab what Jeff just said, because I think if there was any theme to the last 5+ years of COBT, it's been that natural gas is a great source of energy. It meets a lot of the criteria that we're all gunning for. And now, either because of data centers or the AI explosion or the change in administration, or we just finally sobered up on a lot of stuff, its day seems to be here. What would you say about natural gas attitudes, and do you feel have they shifted as much as we feel like maybe they have?
I certainly think that they have shifted. When I first came to Washington, natural gas was really viewed as, a waste product in many ways. I first came to Washington, D.C. about 25 years ago. And then we pivoted during the Obama period to it being what he called a bridge fuel. And now what I call it is a forever fuel. And what I think we're going to continue to see is that we're going to need a heck of a lot of natural gas, and we're seeing it in the marketplace. And that's mainly because energy demand is only going up in the world. And natural gas is going to be the, I think, supplier of choice for a lot of these data centers and a lot of the AI technologies that are coming onto the market. I can't go to an energy conference now where there isn't a hyperscaler present talking about how much demand there is going to be for natural gas. And that's a great thing for the American industry, but it's a tremendous thing for the United States of America, because we have the natural gas here, and we're going to be able to supply that future. And that AI future is going to be what really makes the difference for the competitive future of the United States.
So, Mike, you mentioned the hyperscalers. This is another fascinating development. Is now one of America's preeminent industries, tech, has become heavily engaged in the energy and power space because they are a huge customer. They got to have it. They need, in some cases, regulatory help to get it. There's all kinds of things that have to happen to get them what they need. Is that another shocker for you? I was thinking you started in 2018 at the API. I'm guessing you weren't meeting a lot of tech companies in your first year, and now you probably are, and attitudes have changed a lot. Maybe touch on that relationship.
Yeah, I mean, that relationship certainly has evolved. Here at API, we've always known that energy growth, energy demand was going to continue to increase. And it's not just because of AI and more data centers powering the world. It was always going to increase. When you have billions of people that don't have access to the kind of energy that we have here in the United States, we knew that that energy demand was going to continue to grow. But think about the difference in the world from when Donald Trump was president for the first 4 years and what we're dealing with today, where energy demand in his first 4 years really didn't go up that much. And now, during his second term in office, after that Biden interregnum, what you're seeing now is rapid demand growth, not just in the United States, but throughout the world. And so when President Trump declared an energy emergency, there were a lot of people that scoffed at that. But what is it if not an energy emergency? When we see that ICF just said that energy demand is going to go up by 25% by 2030 and 50% by 2050. What is it if not an energy emergency? We have to be making those investments today in the energy infrastructure that we're going to need. And a lot of that infrastructure is going to require moving our products from where they are today to where they need to be. That means pipeline infrastructure. That means high-powered transmission lines. But it's also a recognition that, yes, we're going to need a heck of a lot more wind and solar on the grid, but we're also going to need continued natural gas on the grid as well. And that's why I think that the future is bright for this industry in the United States. And we're excited about the opportunity to work with this administration to build out an infrastructure that makes sense for the next American economy.
So, Mike, you mentioned in your comments there, infrastructure, which means you can start anywhere you like, and then you always end up back at permitting. What is your sort of crystal ball on when we might actually start to make some real progress in that area? And I suppose the thing we hear from a lot of energy, infrastructure, power, et cetera, people is they would love not only to have it fixed, but to have it fixed in a permanent way, so to speak, so that you don't have to worry that then there's another administration that changes all the rules and, flip-flop and all this kind of stuff. What's your latest on all that?
Yeah, what I'd say is that durability is really the coin of the realm here. And if you don't have a durable permitting system, it's going to be very difficult to build anything in this country. But this has been a problem for decades and decades. I'll remind you that when we built the Trans-Alaska Pipeline in the late 1970s, that took an act of Congress to get done. An act of Congress that waived the EIS in the state of Alaska was the reason why we were able to build the Trans-Alaska Pipeline. So these issues have been around for decades and decades and decades. It's gotten a lot worse over the year, which is one of the reasons why we were very pleased with the decision that was made at the Supreme Court just last week, ensuring and that decision was really focused on how NEPA should be interpreted throughout the country. And this was really the second big decision where the Supreme Court reminded lower courts about what the real purpose of NEPA is. And I do think that this could end up being a seminal decision. But again, it's not just for oil and natural gas. It's for all kinds of energy infrastructure going forward, and getting us back to the place where NEPA is actually interpreted in the way that it was intended, not to be continually dragged out time and time again for all of these infrastructure projects, is welcome. But the real thing that has to happen is Congress and the president have to get serious about doing a big, comprehensive infrastructure permitting bill so that we can actually get these things built as quickly as possible. I'm unfortunately a little bit pessimistic just because of how partisan this environment has become. But I do think that there is a big deal out there between those that believe that we have to build these high-powered transmission lines and those of us that just want to continue to build pipelines throughout this country to support the American economy of the future.
So Mike, on this one, you are a longstanding Washington observer, participant, leader. This type of thing where we need the bill that you just referenced, we need to put this in ink and put it behind us. Do you think we're going to see, because it really feels like people would understand it, if you really put in front of the American people, look, here's the problem, here's what we have to build, here's how long it takes, we need jobs, we need growth, this is the bill, call your congressional representative, call your senator. We don't seem to have good old-fashioned pushes like that anymore to get something done that needs to be done. Are we going to see that, or is that sort of an archaic type way to get stuff done?
Well, look, I still believe that big things can get done in this country, but it requires presidential leadership. And unfortunately, we didn't see it under the Biden administration. I do think that President Trump is very focused on getting permitting accomplished. And I will add that they are doing everything that they can do at an administrative level to get things built. And that's very encouraging. Mm-hmm. But we go back to that term, durability. What is durable? What can actually get built in the time period that we have? And that's the challenge. When you're dealing with four-year presidencies and you have an administration that is focused on building big things, what you really need is federal law that puts these things into place. And I will say that the most important component of permitting reform is judicial reform. Because from our perspective, you talk to an API member and they're able to get their permits. They don't get them as in a timely way that they would like to get them. But by and large, we can get through the permitting process. It's the endless judicial review that occurs afterwards, which is why this Supreme Court decision that occurred just last week, the 7 counties decision, was so very, very important. Now we need the lower courts to follow suit. And we need a permitting bill established in law that actually puts some time limits on the number of judicial reviews that actually can occur.
Do you think, Mike, if you were talking to the administration about the timing, the sequence, the plan for all this, when would be a great time to introduce the legislation? Like when might we see that?
Well, unfortunately, Congress is a little bit preoccupied right now. All of the focus right now is on the reconciliation bill. And let me explain to your viewers and listeners what essentially reconciliation is. So reconciliation is you're reconciling the budget that has been passed with the laws that are in place. So the House and the Senate have passed a budget, and now they're getting to work on reconciling current law with what the budget is that they passed. So unlike in my church where reconciliation requires a priest, there's no priest involved here, but there's a heck of a lot of prayer that goes on in trying to get a big reconciliation bill done. And there's a lot of whipping going on and a lot of work going on to try to get this bill through the United States Senate. And that's just sucking up all of the oxygen in the United States. But let's not forget that there is significant permitting reform in the House-passed reconciliation bill. I'll give you an example of that. So in the House-passed reconciliation bill, it mandates lease sales in the Gulf of America. It mandates lease sales in Cook Inlet. And it encourages more lease sales onshore as well and in the state of Alaska. That is a very big development. But again, it shouldn't be that way. We should have a more regular process for permitting for us to get big things built in this country. But it's welcome news that under the House-passed reconciliation bill, that there are mandatory lease sales that's going to cut back that regulatory barrage that we face every time that we're trying to get big things done in this country. I'll remind your listeners that unfortunately under President Biden, we only had 1 lease sale in the Gulf of America. And it was only a consequence of the Inflation Reduction Act, of the Biden-passed Inflation Reduction Act, that Joe Manchin required there to be lease sales in the Gulf. There wouldn't have been any were it not for Joe Manchin's intervention. So an administration can do a lot to slow down production in this country, as we saw over the previous 4 years. But a Congress can step in, as they are in this reconciliation package, and advance the importance of development of America's resources. So while there isn't comprehensive permitting reform in the reconciliation bill, there are big things that are going to get done as a consequence if we can get this bill over the finish line.
You mentioned the IRA. The IRA, now the reconciliation is in the Senate, and all this is going to have to square. I've noticed a couple of things happening around the IRA that we've been talking about. One, in a situation where we're all desperately worried about power prices and there is a energy crisis, the argument is being made that if you slow down the pace of adding solar and wind, you could increase power prices. So that's something that's out there. Another one that's out there is just representatives and senators saying, hey, a lot of this stuff that the IRA funded is happening in my state, and therefore I want it. I suppose a third thing that's out there is, we noticed Chris Wright's testimony where so much of a lot of capital left Washington, D.C., after November 5th and before the change in administration. So a lot of it's being reevaluated. There's certainly some question marks there. So there's just a lot of noise around the IRA, and it looks like the House sees it different from the Senate. What would you tell us about that? How does it fit in? How do you get involved in a situation like that?
Yeah, I mean, the first way that I would respond is, unfortunately, it's policymakers, it's politicians that write our laws, not economists. So what might be the best economic option for how we advance this energy future that makes sense on a piece of paper that we could draw up doesn't necessarily make sense for the political environment in which a lot of these politicians are making these decisions. So I had an old boss who used to say that, we do two things in Washington. We do public policy and we do it in a political environment. And so the environment that we're working in, of course, is very partisan. And that means that this is going to be a Republican-only bill. And every Republican in the House and the Senate is going to have big priorities on what they want to get done. Not all of them represent the state of Texas or the state of New Mexico or the state of Pennsylvania that are big energy superpowers. And many of them, have a lot of projects in their districts that may be funded by the Inflation Reduction Act. And so they're going to have to piece this bill together in a way that makes sense, not just for energy, but for all of the other big priorities that they're trying to accomplish. And so we're working in that political environment as well. So we put forward 20 top priorities for reconciliation at the beginning of this process. Some of them included the big tax provisions, like keeping the corporate rate at 21%, or making bonus depreciation a permanent part of federal law, or other key energy provisions that we have advanced. But we're advancing some of these key natural resources provisions, like mandatory lease sales in the Gulf and in Alaska and onshore. So we got most of those key provisions in the House reconciliation bill. There are a couple of things that still have to be done, like fixing the IDC provisions as it relates to the corporate average minimum tax. That is a big priority for us. Advancing the hydrogen tax credit as well is a top priority for the American Petroleum Institute. So there are some things that we're going to have to give as we go into the Senate process, and a lot of things that we're going to be continuing to advance because the House bill did a pretty good job in advancing the interests of all parties, and we're excited to move on to the Senate to work on those big things.
Hey, Mike, first of all, I just want to thank you for, leading the API. You've done a fantastic job, and we want to note that. I also like the couple of Churchill books behind you. It just kind of shows all about leadership, and so that's awesome. Maybe to kind of, circle back on this whole House bill. I mean, I think most people were really stunned that it was gutted of the renewable tax credits, and obviously it's got to go through Senate. There's going to be some reconciliation there, but if you think about if we have a bill to sign in front of the president's desk, what does it look like? Does it have? Is it gutted of those tax credits? Is it somewhere in between? What is the thought process right now in DC for that?
Yeah, great question. One of the reasons I'm a Churchillian myself. I'm a huge fan of Churchill, and one of the reasons is he played such a significant role in the oil age, right? Switching the Royal Navy from being powered by coal to being powered by oil. That was a seminal shift in world history. But to the specific question on what this looks like at the end of the day, I mean, everybody's going to have to give a little. There's been a lot of conversation about the so-called 45 tax credits. These are the 45Q for carbon capture, 45V for hydrogen, 45Z for sustainable aviation fuel, and on and on and on. And a lot of those were expanded, and some of them were even created in the Inflation Reduction Act. And so there's a pull and a tug with members of Congress right now as to what the status of those are going to be. And ultimately, it's the lawmakers are going to have to make some decisions. I ultimately think that, most of those tax credits, at least the ones that we care about, and I mentioned the three, Q, V, and Z are the ones that we really care about. I think ultimately they stay in place. They may get trimmed back a little bit, as a consequence of that, horse trading that's going to go on in the United States Congress. But I think ultimately the 45 tax credits, survive and will have the ability to continue to thrive as part of the energy mix. So there are a lot of other provisions that are going to face a similar fate. Of course, you mentioned wind and solar. The ITC, PTC are top priorities for the wind and solar community. But those have been around for many, many, many years. One principle that we have is that there should be these kinds of programs for emerging technologies, but at some point they're not emerging any longer. They are well established. And does it continue to make sense when you've had these programs around for decades that they continue to be, a remnant of the tax code? And that is a key question I think that lawmakers are going to have to answer.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting. You from the API, we're asking you about renewable tax credits. So I think it's just evidence of, this is more of an energy discussion now. And so I was curious, what are some, how is that changing who API works with, who you team up with, who you interact with. I presume because we continue to see energy converging in power in the source commodities, but I'm just curious how that's evolving, who you interact with.
Yeah, I mean, let's be clear here. The American Petroleum Institute is the oil and gas trade association, and all of our members are oil and gas companies. So my biggest members are Exxon, Chevron, BP, Shell. We also have, the big refiners like Phillips 66 and Marathon Petroleum. We have the independent producers like Diamondback and ConocoPhillips. But we also represent the midstream sector, folks like Enbridge and Plains All American. So we really are the only association in Washington, D.C. That represents the full value stream of the American oil and gas industry. So we will always, fight for the oil and gas sector first and foremost. But you're right, the energy landscape is significantly changing. And that means that our partnerships are changing as well. And so we build coalitions, with other like-minded people who understand how important oil and gas is going to be into the future, which is why this coalition with the hyperscalers and the tech community is so very important. And it's going to continue to be, a hallmark of our advocacy going forward.
Mike, I was thinking, one feature of the current landscape in Washington that is just it symbolizes what a different approach this administration is taking, which is the National Energy Dominance Council. So, it's not only coordination and it's not only a prioritization around energy, it's the word dominance is in there. So this is a unique animal. Do you mind talking about how you see that functioning? Can you tell, is that initiative really going to bring a policy together around energy? And then, of course, you have Doug Burgum and Chris Wright, so two people that really stone cold know energy and are partnered together, which is another interesting feature. But maybe just talk about this development. From a policy standpoint, it's very unique.
Yeah, let me reflect a little bit on my personal history. So in 2005, I actually worked for the National Economic Council under President Bush. And the role of these councils is to coordinate policy across various different agencies within government. It shouldn't be lost on anybody that we have a really big government right now, and you need that kind of coordination and that kind of leadership at the presidential level if you're going to have success getting big things done. So the vision of the Energy Dominance Council is absolutely correct, that you need a White House-led office that is focused on making sure that the Energy Department, the Interior Department, the EPA, and all of the other various agencies are doing everything they need to do to promote energy development in the United States. And I say it was a long time coming. This is exactly the kind of thing that we needed at the White House level. And we're excited that President Trump has recognized the need to do this. And I wouldn't trade the energy team for any other team in this administration. Between Burgum and Wright and Zeldin, these are three people who have a firm understanding of how important American energy is. And we've worked with them already very closely on these big things. We're also pleased to see that all three of them are this week in the great state of Alaska, talking about how important Alaska is going to be for our energy future going forward. So it's an exciting week for the state of Alaska, but it also could be an exciting week for the United States as well. One of the big things they're talking about is the potential for an LNG terminal to be built in the state. The current way that we deal with natural gas, which is a byproduct, of course, of the development of oil on the North Slope. I mean, it is really insane. Because they don't have any place to put the natural gas right now in Alaska. So they're literally taking the natural gas that is produced when they're producing oil, and they're just pumping it back into the ground. This could be an incredible resource, not just for the United States, but for our Asian partners as well, if we can get that terminal built. So it's exciting that they recognize that opportunity. Alaska is a significant state that is resource blessed. I've been there a number of different times. We have the ability to do this in an environmentally responsible way, and I'm pleased to see that the administration is taking on this huge responsibility.
Well, and you mentioned Alaska, but it seems like philosophically the administration seems to be pushing decision making whether it's around oil and gas or other natural resource questions, they're pushing these things back to the states to let them do what they want to do. Is that a trend you see, a philosophy you see? You think that's going to have some positive impacts?
We would certainly welcome that. And there are a couple of different places where I think it could be very helpful. So particularly when it comes to carbon capture and sequestration, giving the states primacy on how to regulate that, I think would be a welcome sign. We were able to get it in the state of Louisiana, which is really going to become a CCS hub, I think, going forward. Now we're working on Texas, where we should give them primacy in regulating these things. So that is a place where I do think that this administration is focused, and we would certainly welcome it, particularly in states that have put a focus on oil and gas development.
Now, I'll do the flip side of that argument, though. Last week, we had a Professor Miche on from USC, who had just done a study. It's 200 pages of great work around why are gas prices so high in California, and he went through the whole value chain there. The interesting thing, well, a lot of it was interesting, but a couple of things jumped out. One, his conclusion was, this is pretty much caused by the state of California. There's no reason for these prices to exist. And then the second thing he pointed out that really jumped out that we don't talk about a lot is he said, look, there are important military bases here. This is an important part of the economy. If you don't do it here, you bring it in from adversaries. So he pointed out the national security problems with the choices California is making. I guess I'm just pausing to say not all states get it right. And California is a situation where it doesn't seem like we're getting it right. It's an understatement. What do you think about those issues, and how can the federal government improve the situation when a state is making choices like that?
Well, I listened to that podcast with interest. I have a son who lives in LA, graduated from the University of Southern California. So I was glad to hear that there's a USC professor that agrees with our perspective on these things. What's happening in California is exactly the opposite of what we should be doing. They're down to 14 refineries when there were over 20 in the year 2000. They're going to be down to 11 by the end of this year as a result of conversions and future closings. And energy demand is only going up in the state. So it's the exact opposite of what we should be doing. And I hope that other states take lessons from that. Congress finally intervened just last week when Congress said that they would not impose the California EV mandate on the other states that have waived into it. And stopped California from doing this EV mandate on their own constituents. That was a welcome sign, and we're excited about the opportunity to see President Trump sign that into law. We expect this Wednesday. It is a sea change from where we were just a few years ago, where the EPA and the Department of Transportation were imposing these new regulations to really mandate EV sales throughout the country. Consumers should have a choice. EVs make sense for a lot of different people, but they don't make sense for every American, which is why repealing the California mandate was so very, very important. So you're right. Some states are going to get this right. Some states are going to get this wrong. I do think, though, that that's the laboratory of democracy that the founders envisioned. But for national security purposes in particular, the American oil and gas industry has become such a strategic importance, has such strategic importance right now that we need to be developing these resources, not just in Texas and New Mexico and Pennsylvania, but we need to be looking throughout the United States and allow these resources to develop, because we live in a very, very volatile world right now. And if you don't have oil and gas being produced wherever we can find it, we're putting ourselves at a very significant strategic advantage.
So maybe we could just build on that, the strategic importance of the industry. Mike mentioned up front the EOG deal that announced last week, and you referenced lease sales. And I guess I wonder, is it on your members' radar? and therefore is it part of your discussions in Washington, D.C. that, okay, yes, we have a amazing and a globally competitive oil and gas industry that makes us so much better, but we cannot assume that we'll have that for decades to come. And if we're going to have that, we're going to have to support the industry. We're going to have to open up more acreage. We're going to have to make it easier for them to do things. Like, is there a concern that we're taking the industry for granted and therefore kind of risking our national security if we don't get more focused on what does America's oil and gas production look like, 10 years from now?
Yeah, well, let me relate a story to you. So, at the beginning of Biden's term, his new Secretary of Energy actually came to an API board meeting at our invitation. We were excited to welcome her to the board meeting. So this was in June of 2021. And she promptly, went to tell us and tell the API CEOs that were in the room that if we didn't change business models, if we didn't convert to a renewable future, we would be like Kodak, meaning that we would go away and that we would no longer be going concerns. I think everybody in that room, thought to themselves, we know how important this industry is going to be. And it is only because of the abundance of resources that we have in this country that we've been able to continue to keep prices low for American consumers. Shortly after that, just one short year after that, Secretary Granholm went to CERAWeek and begged the industry to increase production. Turn on the spigots, she said, because prices had increased so dramatically. I do think that there is a growing energy reality in this country, not just among Republicans, but among Democrats too, about how important oil and gas is going to be for the future. We see it all over the place. We saw it just last week when the United States House of Representatives and the Senate, on a bipartisan basis, repealed the California EV mandate. 35 Democrats in the House of Representatives and a Democratic senator from the state of Michigan voted to repeal that. So I do think that the energy transition has been taken over by energy reality. And there is a full recognition by both sides of the aisle how important, how strategically important this industry is going to be, not just now, not just for the next 10 years, but for decades and decades to come. So that is a welcome sign. And we're excited about the opportunity to work with both sides of the aisle to build that energy future that we all know that we're going to need if we're going to power the generation of AI.
Just thinking about capital and capital availability to oil and gas. And that could mean a lot of things. It could mean lending banks. It could mean sort of the ESG community and some of the battles that were fought over capital getting into oil and gas, or it could mean just the profitability of the industry. Do you talk to capital providers, banks, et cetera? Do you have a sense of the overall relationship there, the willingness of those entities to keep lending and investing? Like, what would you say about the health of all that?
Interestingly, during this same period that I mentioned with Secretary Granholm, during that exact same period of time, we had both Larry Fink from BlackRock and Jamie Dimon from JP Morgan, come to the API board and come to the API and talk about how important continued investments in oil and gas are going to be as part of their portfolios. And this was during the period where everyone was starting to get concerned about the so-called woke capitalism that was occurring, and that they were going to start divesting in oil and gas. We certainly haven't seen that. Oil and gas is going to continue to be a robust part of those portfolios, but the industry has a responsibility too to have that fiscal discipline. And one of the things that I think we see in the marketplace, and we follow this stuff very, very closely, is while it looks like we may be going into a low commodity cycle, the industry is much better capitalized than it was when we went through this in 2020 during the COVID period. So while nobody likes to see, $50, $60 oil, I think that capital discipline has really taken hold within the industry, and we're in a much better position than we have been during other downturns.
Mike, a couple of points and maybe a question here. 2 points you made. First, seeing Burgum, Wright, and Zeldin in the same room, 3 cabinet positions in the same rooms, much less in Alaska. I don't think I've ever seen anything like that, number one. Number two, Burgum talking about, hey, let's look at the left side of the balance sheet rather than the right side of the balance sheet with 35 trillion in debt. It could be 100 trillion of assets. I thought that was really interesting too. But I think the third question, the third point, maybe a question for you is, I'm looking at natural gas growth projections out to 2030, anywhere from 10 to 30 BCF. In our lead-in, we talked about basically Governor Hochul saying we might be able to look at some, energy infrastructure in our state. That doesn't mean it's going to happen, but just getting the look, that's a whole change of attitude there. So I guess my question for you is, when you think about that 10 to 30 BCF of growth in natural gas over the next, through the end of the decade, if we can get some permitting reform, if we can get some, Governor Hochul, people like that to really be open-minded, are you really, really positive on the direction where we're at right now? Because it seems like we've hit an inflection point, not only from a Republican standpoint, but also a Democratic standpoint. Am I reading that wrong?
No, I think you're absolutely right. And let me make a key point here. Policy matters. As much as we all would like it for us to be in this free market environment where people make the best choices in the position that they're in based on the capital that is allotted, policy matters in this country. And let me give you a perfect example of that. In my last year on Capitol Hill in 2015, the most important policy decision for the oil and gas industry was made in decades. And it's one of those things that has completely gone under the radar. And that was when we lifted the oil export ban. And that was a consequence of a bipartisan compromise where the wind and solar community got an expanded ITC and PTC, and the oil industry got the ability to export crude oil that had been essentially banned since the 1970s. We did a study on this, and as a consequence of opening new markets to American oil and gas, we've added about 3 million new barrels in American production. That is the most consequential thing that the Congress has done in decades to advance the American oil and gas industry, and it came as a consequence of a bipartisan compromise. I believe that if we could get a big bipartisan compromise on permitting reform, that could be the next oil export ban. That it could have that big of a consequence in terms of development, not just of oil and gas, but of all energy sources. So policies are going to continue to matter. So Governor Hochul's decision that she's going to relook at some of these permits for the Constitution pipeline is welcome. And by the way, it looks like it was a consequence, again, of a bipartisan compromise in allowing Empire Wind to go forward off the coast of New York State. So big things happen when you work in a bipartisan way. And even in one of the most partisan times that we've ever seen in this country, you can still get big things done. And those are the things that are most durable.
Well, to put those two concepts together, we started with durability, was a key theme. We just talked about bipartisan and congressional acts. Outside of congressional law, what are some things that we could look to in the policy world as signs of durable rules of the road? So, I mean, obviously, we'd love to see everything, in congressional law enacted, but that's going to be difficult, given all the things that we've all talked about. But are there other things you look at as signals for more durable action?
Yeah, I mean, I certainly think, and I welcome what the administration is doing, particularly what they're doing on the permitting side. And I think if given the ability, we're going to be able to continue to build the things that this country needs. There's some great stuff happening at the state level too, where we work very closely with state governments as well in building out energy infrastructure and advancing our industry. So API isn't just a federal trade association. We also have 8 regional offices in the state that advance those priorities. So we work very closely with state lawmakers also on building out energy policy that makes sense. And again, we do that in a bipartisan manner. So it won't surprise you, Pennsylvania is the #2 natural gas producing state We have an office in Harrisburg, and we've made tremendous strides in building out natural gas in the state of Pennsylvania. Ohio is another state like that, where we have to work on a bipartisan basis to get big things done. Interestingly, we work we have an office in Boston as well that has been key to help on a regional basis to building out natural gas infrastructure, because they're so starved for energy in the Northeast. So there are a lot of things happening at the state and the local level that are very, very impactful. And sometimes we get distracted by what's going on at the federal level. But a lot of these states, they have to get big things done, particularly if they want to get reelected. And almost all of them have mandates for balanced budgets as well. And we're big taxpayers in a lot of these big states.
I was wondering, Mike, I think we're all, this is a gross oversimplification, but as it relates to tariffs, I think, just take a step back. We're all thinking, look, we're trying to reset the terms of trade with a lot of people. We're trying to improve our hand, the U.S. hand, and there are clearly some participants in the world that violate the terms of trade, and it needs to be addressed. So it's like almost everybody could agree with that. The one country that seems to be like really caught up in that from an energy standpoint, that it gets complex, is Canada. Because I think all of us who've been around energy in the U.S. for a long time understand how the synergies between the U.S. and Canada as it relates to energy are really strong, both in terms of infrastructure and resource and all kinds of things, national security. What do you think about us having a reconciliation with Canada? What do you hear from your members who are also active in Canada? On that issue, what are your thoughts?
So I think unfortunately, I think we've been thinking about Canada all wrong. I believe that the United States and Canada could be a energy powerhouse, where if we see the free flow of oil and gas and energy products across country lines, we could be the most important energy producer in the world. So we would welcome the opportunity to continue to grow those alliances. As you said, I have a lot of member companies who operate in Canada. And by the way, we were able to prevail on the Trump administration during the first round of Canada-Mexico tariffs that they should have 0% tariffs on oil and gas. That was a direct consequence of the meeting that the API Executive Committee had with President Trump in the Oval Office in March. We asked for that. The president delivered on that. As you know, particularly for Midwestern refineries, they depend on that heavier crude that comes from Canada. And a direct consequence of tariffing crude from the country of Canada is going to be higher gas prices on American consumers. President understands that. And I do think, now that we have a new premier in Canada, in Mark Carney, I think that those relationships are already improving. But now it's time for us to take that next step. Now it's time for us to build that energy powerhouse between the United States and Canada. And by the way, Mexico, if we can work with them on this as well, it could be the most powerful energy bloc in the world. But we have to have policies that back that up. And that's what we're encouraged about now. We want to work with them on building that. And I think, by and large, I think the Trump administration is going to be on board with that once we get through this period of time. API is a free market trade association. We're for free markets. We're for free trade. We depend on the free flow of energy products and goods across borders. And we're working every day with the Trump administration to advance that. One of the things that we're saying is that the trade agenda should not get in the way of the energy dominance agenda. And by and large, that has had great resonance with the Energy Dominance Council and the rest of the Trump administration.
So, Mike, one thing that it's certainly come up a lot around this budget reconciliation that it's grown in its importance is the fiscal situation and just the overall debt situation. Do you have, and that has long-term implications for all of us. As a Washington insider and someone who has a lot of policy conversations with a lot of important people, are we going to circle back to the debt, or where do you think deficit reduction and debt reduction, I guess. When are those going to show up more in the policy conversation?
Yeah, it does seem like debt and deficit conversations, have these little peaks and valleys where, back in the, in the 1990s, we dealt with the Concord Coalition and Ross Perot talking about how important debt and deficits were. When I worked for Speaker of the House, John Boehner, when I was his chief of staff, we were in deep negotiations with President Obama about trying to get a big debt deal done. And unfortunately, I think if you ask Speaker Boehner today, he would say it was the greatest regret of his speakership that he wasn't able to get a big debt deal done with President Obama that would have really set the trajectory for us. We're at a similar point now, and bond markets, I think, are have a giant red light yelling stop, and we have to get this fiscal house in order for our country's future. So I do think that this reconciliation bill, it's going to put some significant dollars towards deficit reduction, but we need to do more, and we have to look not just at the discretionary side of the budget, but the mandatory side of the budget too, which is where all of the money is. That's Social Security, that's Medicare, and that's Medicaid. So I hope that policymakers, once they get through this period on the reconciliation package, they really start to look seriously at entitlement reform as well.
So I'll shift gears on you, but this is to my lead, and this is why we love having you. It feels like there's no topic we can't go grab. I think the oil and gas industry employs like 11 million people approximately in the U.S. And one of the issues that comes up no matter what industry you're talking to, but particularly, manufacturing, infrastructure, construction, those types of jobs, is the people issues, like where are we going to find the people? How are we going to get them trained? How are we going to grow the workforce? What would you tell us about that side of things and how we're going to address all that?
Yeah, it's a huge issue. And from our perspective, yes, it's 11 million people. It's 8% of the American economy. I like to say it's the first 8%, because if it weren't for this industry, the rest of the economy just doesn't go. So it should be a focus of every government, of every president, of every governor, which is one of the reasons why we were so disappointed during the Biden administration, where we frequently asked for meetings with industry leaders and President Biden, and those meetings were never granted. In the first 3 months of the Trump administration, the API Executive Committee met with the President of the United States, met with Howard Lutnick, met with Jamieson Greer and Doug Burgum. We have a meeting coming up with Secretary Bessent. So we have an administration that actually recognizes how important this industry is and is going to be for the American future. And we welcome that. By the way, we also work on a bipartisan basis with like-minded Democrats who want to advance this industry, people like Henry Cuellar and Vicente Gonzalez in the state of Texas, and others throughout the country who know how important this industry is. But workforce is a continued challenge. API actually has a program where we try to train people in underprivileged communities to get ready for work in the oil and gas industry. We have a partnership with Sanjak Community College in Houston, where you can actually get an API certificate, which tells API member companies that you're ready to work in the oil and gas industry. So this is a huge issue. We want to work with, on a bipartisan basis with policymakers to make sure we have the right policies in place to promote that. But ultimately, this just comes down to pay, right? And the oil and gas industry pays 50% more than every other industry. And people who want to make a great living can work in the oil field, can work in the corporate offices of these companies, and have a great life. And we have to do a better job of communicating what a great life it can be.
I think you hit on something there, Mike. I mean, one of the things we hear from not only energy companies, but industrial companies is just people issue. They just don't have enough skilled employees. And I thought it was really refreshing when President Trump said, we're going to take some of these dollars we go to, give to Harvard and stuff like that, and really move it towards trade schools. Now that's back to that's saying something. The question is, can we put that into policy? Can we get that done? Because to me, permitting reform is great, but if you don't have people to build this stuff on time and on budget, it's of no use. Maybe talk about, sort of the trade schools. Trump talking about that, was that something you said, you know what, yeah, that's really, really needed, and that's something that's no one really ever talks about? Maybe some thoughts there.
I think you're exactly right, Mike. We have a partnership with Lackawanna Community College in the state of Pennsylvania, where they do a tremendous job in training high school graduates to work in the oil field. So this is a partnership that not just API has, but we have with a number of our member companies as well. Something your listeners may not know about the American Petroleum Institute, we were actually started not as an advocacy organization for the oil and gas industry, but as the global standard setter for oil and gas. So right now we maintain over 800 standards for the industry. Those standards oftentimes are referenced in state, federal, and local laws as the gold standard for how you perform for health, environment, and safety protocols. So, that is half of the API business, more than half of my budget, half my people. They really are focused on health, environment, and safety standards and certifications for the global oil and gas industry. So one of the things that we've done with those standards is we've taken those standards and we've given them to local community colleges so that they can train their students up on those standards so they're job ready on day one. This is an important workforce development initiative, but it's also the way that we get qualified people in the oil field as quickly as possible. Lackawanna is a perfect example of how that has worked really, really well. And we want to work with other universities to do this also. By the way, we're also working with historically Black colleges and universities in places like Southern University in Baton Rouge. You all know what an oil and gas town Baton Rouge actually is. So it's important that we're in the places where these people are graduating from as well. And so it's an exciting program we have, and one where I think it's going to yield tremendous benefits for the industry going forward.
Mike, some of the discussion around policy, thus far in the Trump administration, we could have guessed going in, permit reform, some of the reforms of the EPA. Some things like potential for Constitution moving forward in New York, we wouldn't have guessed. If we're sitting here 3 years from now, what are some other candidates for potential surprises on the energy policy front?
Well, look, I do think there's been a lot of discussion about, of course, the president's trade agenda. I think we have to look at the president's trade agenda as really a negotiating agenda. I think it could be, if we look back 3 years from now, that this president has actually opened overseas markets to more American goods than any other president in history, if they do this right. That's what this is. This is a negotiation about getting more American products to break through these overseas non-tariff barriers. And so if we think about this as a brief step to get to a more free market-based economy for American energy products in particular, I think we could look back and really see this as an opportunity for us to get big things done that advance our free trade agenda. It's not pretty right now, but I do think that is ultimately the goal, to lower tariffs for American goods going into some of these markets that have been locked up. I advised President Bush on trade policy back in 2005 when I was working in the Bush White House. And the number of non-tariff barriers for American goods going into these international markets are tremendous. And if we actually have an opportunity with these countries on a bilateral basis to cut those barriers, it could be a sea change for the American economy and for access to those markets. So yeah, there's a lot of disruption right now, but I do think that you could see a scenario, Jeff, where we look back 3 years from now and say, wow, we've actually been able to lower some barriers that we never thought we were going to be able to lower just 4 years before.
Mike, as we wrap up, you're hitting on something in the tariff debate that it just doesn't get enough play, seemingly, which is the non-tariff barriers. So we were visiting with some people last week about, you would think the most logical conclusion is, well, let's have zero tariffs on both sides. Right, but if it's zero tariffs on both sides and we don't have a lot of non-tariff barriers and they do have a lot of non-tariff barriers, then it isn't even. So is there anything you would tell us about what's going on in the quote non-tariff barrier discussions that maybe the public doesn't appreciate, like some of the big key ones?
Yeah, what I'd say is that we do have to be realistic when it comes to non-tariff barriers. So, for example, the administration has highlighted the high value-added taxes that exist in a lot of these blocks as areas that they want to stop. Well, the VAT is how they, by and large, they fund their governments. So it is unlikely that the European bloc, for example, is going to completely change their VAT in these trade negotiations. But there are other tariff barriers that the European Union puts into place that I think are more realistic to look at. And by the way, those are emerging almost every single day. So I know on this podcast, you all have talked about the CSDDD guidance out of the European Union. That is an area that could completely eliminate American oil and gas companies from operating in the European Union. I think that should be considered a non-tariff barrier. There are a number of other regulatory things that are happening in the European Union. For example, on differentiated natural gas. If they want us to be able to trace natural gas back and make sure that it is produced environmentally in an environmentally sound way, one of the things that we're pushing for is to ensure that that the European regulatory bodies look at the American methane regulatory regime in an equivalent manner. But if they don't do that, that could be an impediment for American natural gas, LNG, to go to the European Union. That would be a disaster, one, for European consumers, and two, from a national security perspective. So I think sometimes we get caught up in these discussions about VATs when there's such a significant regulatory regime in the European Union and in other countries that really harm the ability for American goods, particularly American energy, to make it into these markets. And those are only growing. So as the Trump administration considers these trade negotiations, we're trying to make sure that those kinds of things are on the agenda as well. Fantastic.
Well, Mike, we knew this would be a tour de force. We so appreciate you coming on and being willing to just talk about anything and everything. And we just appreciate all the good things you're doing for energy policy in Washington, D.C. So thank you so much for the time.
Thank you, Maynard. And thanks, by the way, for what you do to help educate people on these important policy issues.
Well, it's our pleasure. We enjoy it. Thank you, sir. And thanks, everybody.